Welcome, everyone. This is the 12th seminar in our series, and it's very nice to have Hilary Jennings with us. Hilary is an advisory board member for the Advisory Board of Creatures, and she works across the arts and culture sectors, focusing on sustainability, leadership, and facilitation. And she's here with us in her capacity as the director of the Happy Museum, which is an organization that invites people to think afresh about the role of museums and offers different perspectives and responses to change. I won't say much more about her. I will give her the floor. She will have a short presentation, and then there will be a little discussion at the end. So Hilary, welcome, and thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to speak probably for about half an hour, 40 minutes, but just stop me and interrupt and ask questions and so on. That's fine. Okay, so while I'm setting up my shared screen, I'm going to ask you to do something. I'd like you all, if you would, to just for a minute think about something in your life that keeps you well. So when you're having a bad day or a bad week or things are not going smoothly, the thing that you think, oh, if I can just have that, if I just have that in my life, or I'm just able to do that, or just have a little think about what keeps you well while I set my screen up. Okay, is that okay? Cool. Well, I'll come back to that. I'll come back to that later. Yeah, so I'm director of the Happy Museum project, and basically we focus on the role of museums in the frame of supporting the well-being of people, place and planet. So I'm going to say a little bit about the context behind Happy Museum because it's quite important, and then I'm going to sort of framing we use, and then I'm going to talk quite a lot about how we approach that and what museums have done in that respect. But I'm going to start with this, which is a picture of planet Earth taken in 1990 by the Voyager 1 space probe as it left the solar system. And at the request of the astronomer Carl Sagan, it turned its camera around and it took one last picture of Earth before it was impossible to see, and that's that tiny dot that you can see on the screen in the beam of sunlight. And he wrote a piece, which I'm just going to read a short section from, called The Pale Blue Dot. Look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was lived out their lives. Every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilizations. Every mother, father, and hopeful child in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. The Earth is the only world known so far to harbour life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate. Like it or not, for the moment the Earth is where we make our stand. He went on to say that the image underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. So this perspective of our home planet, our ability to see ourselves as separate, as the fragility of our planet in the vastness of space, is really one that we've held for a very short period of time in terms of human history, and a tiny time in the span of geological time. But despite this understanding, we treat the planet like there is no tomorrow. And we've entered a new geological era, the Anthropocene, defined by the impact of humanity on our ecosystems. Our activity, we see this now very, very frequently. The activity is changing the climate. We see heat waves, droughts. We've got floods in Canada at the moment, unprecedented fires. So the weight of evidence is that we are having huge impacts on the planet, and the urgency of this is becoming increasingly clear. And as this diagram from Future Earth shows us, climate change and extreme weather are only part of an interconnected network of systemic crises, which include biodiversity loss, food and water crises, and most recently the global pandemic. And these crises are escalating at an alarming rate. A major contributor to the crises is the exponential growth in our levels of material consumption, which are driving us beyond the natural limits of the Earth. Earth Overshoot Day marks the day when humanity's consumption of resources in a given year exceeds what the Earth can regenerate in that year. According to the network's calculations, Overshoot Day has moved forward in the calendar from early October in the year 2000 to August in 2020. And as this image shows, we're now exceeding 160% of the Earth's biocapacity. And our levels of consumption are by no means equal. This table, also from the Global Footprint Network, shows the relative scale of consumption in different countries against the resources of the world. And you can see here, those of us in the UK, we'd need, if everybody in the world consumed at the same scale we did, we'd need 2.7 planets in order to survive. And it's only the low consumption of many populations that hold us in any sort of balance. And a significant element of this exponential growth is driven by overconsumption, by need for more and more, faster and faster. Better and better. And this is an image by Chris. You can see it's quite an old image because of the phones that are shown from Chris Jordan, which shows that nearly 500,000 cell phones thrown away every day in the United States alone, and all the embedded carbon and materials in those lost. So our extractive economy results in waste, pollution, and environmental degradation on a global scale. And the material impacts of our destructive relationship with the environment are combined with huge societal impacts: inequality, deprivation, poverty, and racial injustice, impacts which have been exacerbated and exposed during the global pandemic. Both material and societal impacts share roots in our history of systemic domination, colonialism, and the logic of extractive capitalism. Crises of social and environmental justice emanate from the same mode of inhabiting the world, as described by Ghassan Haj, as an occupying force, imposing its own interest, subordinating others for the extraction of value, and eradicating or exterminating what gets in the way. Many of our museums and their collections are embedded within and have benefited from this mode of inhabiting the world. And understanding this heritage and its current legacy is essential if we want to genuinely address these systemic crises. Anyone who thinks there can be limitless growth in a limited environment is either mad or an economist. But economic growth, or GDP, is currently the key way we measure societal progress. It's a measurement of the goods and services produced in a country's borders over a specified time. But however useful it is, it has some key flaws. It encourages the depletion of resources by its focus on the need for constant growth in production and consumption. There's a rationale there that just doesn't fit with the reality of our environment. It can't differentiate between spending on good things like education or terrible things like the money that's needed to repair and rebuild after natural disasters. And it doesn't measure the economic services that nature provides, such as fresh water or fresh air or caring for our children. As President Robert Kennedy said about GDP, back in 1968, it measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. As Kate Raworth identifies in her fantastic book, Donut Economics, we have economies that need to grow whether or not they make us thrive, whereas we need economies that make us thrive whether or not they grow. And there are many, many other ways we can measure societal progress. Around the world, countries are launching political and economic frameworks that prioritise the well-being of their citizens in a holistic approach to tackling our systemic crises. As early as the 1970s, Bhutan developed a system of gross domestic happiness. And in 2015, Wales introduced the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And in 2019, New Zealand, its first wellbeing budget. As Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern explained, we're embedding that notion of making decisions that aren't just about growth for growth's sake, but how are our people faring? She said, how is their overall well-being? How is our environment doing? However, it's essential that any approach to is underpinned by social justice and equity. And there's a quote here from Martin Luther King. We've experienced and perhaps better understood the interconnectedness and interdependence our interconnectedness and independence on a local and global scale as a result of the global pandemic. And we have to apply this understanding to climate crisis also. So these are the broad conceptual frames that underpin the Happy Museum project, and they were brought together in 2012, where we launched a provocation to museums, the Happy Museum paper, a tale of how it could all turn out all right. Over the years, we've developed projects and commissions, testing out these ideas in practice in museums, alongside a process of evaluation and reflection. So I'm going to show a little bit about how we work, and then I'll talk a bit about the kind of work that museums did in respect of this. Christine, I have to say, with sharing my screen, I can't now see my clock. So if I do look like I'm running out of time, just do wave because I can see your face.
Will do, no worries.
Okay. So first of all, we think systemically, and I think you see that from the conceptual framework that we've just described. We encourage people to inquire into the deep and complex challenges we face, and to explore their interconnections and seek holistic and multi-solving approaches. We expand and we enrich our thinking with perspectives from beyond museums. That's been a real key part of our work, including economists, psychologists, civic managers, ecologists, artists, and activists. And we think about the global system and what the levers, the biggest levers are for change in any given system. The work of Donella Meadows tells us about this. And the biggest levers for change in any system are the goal and the paradigm. And in our system, we have the goal of GDP, but we wish to move that to a different goal around human and planetary well-being. And the paradigm is the kind of culture within that goal sits. And obviously, as cultural institutions, we're looking to influence the paradigm also. Secondly, we embrace complexity. We take encouragement from the fact that the world is complex, and in that very complexity, solutions may arise. This is a quote from Kevin Anderson, Professor of Energy and Climate Change at the University of Manchester. And it was after the previous COP, I think, that he was asked, is there anything that gives you hope? And this is what he said: we live in a very complex world, not a complicated world. Climate change is a complex problem, and things come out that you would never anticipate. In fact, you could not have anticipated them. And the good thing about this is it makes every single person, all 7 billion of us, agents for change. And we hold that very, it's a very key concept in Happy Museum thinking. Finally, we act practically. We're committed to people, supporting them to lead and thrive as agents for change. We're not directive. We don't set outcomes, predetermined outcomes. We create space and focus and provocation and permission to experiment. And that's really the kind of underpinning of our work. We encourage collaboration, and we try and scale up our responses through networked action. These are the organisations that we've worked with directly, and it's actually getting difficult to fit them all on one slide now. So we've worked with a very wide range of organisations, from tiny volunteer-led museums to large nationals. We've worked with community-led museums, regional museums, tourist attractions, open-air museums, and actually arts organisations, heritage organisations, and even a zoo. So we've worked with a very broad range of organisations. And in different ways. We've commissioned projects, we've run an affiliate scheme, and most recently we've worked with the organisations at the bottom of this list, which are in italics, and we launched a programme called No Going Back, which builds on the particular power of museums to draw on past stories of transition and transformation, which inspires museums and their communities to act. So, for example, Scarborough Museums, who operate in one of the most important geological coastal regions in Europe, are exploring how their natural history collection can connect past and present ecological narratives, create imaginative and speculative futures, and challenge our colonial past. And Leeds Museum are harnessing their natural science collection to explore stories from polar bears and ice caps to orangutans and palm oil, changing distribution to turtles and ocean acidity, to inspire environmental action in their community. And Saltaire, which is a model industrial village built in the 1800s and now is a modern urban village, they're using their heritage collection to reflect on the 19th century environmental issues that were there in the village, which was built to address ill health, pollution, and poor housing standards, and how those things can shed light on our current challenges. So underpinning our work, we have 6 principles which can be applied to museums interested in engaging happy museum thinking. They're interconnected, they're non-hierarchical, and we're constantly exploring and adapting them. First of these is create the conditions for well-being. And we explore how museums can create the conditions for well-being to flourish. We use the 5 ways of well-being, which is one of the simplest measures of well-being, really. It's a bit simplistic, but it does encapsulate research from all around the world into people's well-being, and the idea that if we're all able to engage with these 5 things, connecting with each other, be physically active, take notice and appreciate nature and beauty and music and so on, keep learning throughout your life and give back to others, then it will improve your well-being. And I'm guessing that when we talked earlier about what made you well, that those things touched on these one or more of these 5 ways to well-being. So from a comedian in residence at a former mining museum to the playful museum developed at Manchester Museum, all Happy Museum projects engage with humour, creativity and fun. I'll just talk about one project at the Beanie House in Canterbury, which is the central picture here. They ran a project called the Paper Apothecary, where they got 250 happiness investigators, including staff, community, school children, local residents, and they investigated the museum's collections and found their own happiness prescription within the museum. And then these prescriptions were then given to visitors when they arrived at the museum, and they included, for someone who was feeling a little lonely that day, to receive a free coffee in the cafe, but a coffee that they had to give to somebody else and have a conversation, or for an over-energetic child to go and roar at one of the stuffed lions in the exhibition room. But going beyond the simple pleasurable emotions, we've also explored the work of Martin Seligman, who looks at 3 different aspects of well-being. The first is the pleasant life, which is just enjoying daily pleasures. The second is the good life, where you identify and use your signature strengths and the things that give you something called a eudaimonic flow. And eudaimonic flow is that experience that you have when you're absolutely in the moment. So you get it sometimes from playing a musical instrument, or from making things, or from arts and sport. And being in that state of flow where time seems to pass is very good for our mental well-being. So museums have looked at places where we could experience flow. And then third, pulling these all together, is the meaningful life, where you apply your strengths and skills to something that is greater than yourself, so to a greater good. And so Happy Museum projects have looked at how we can engage all these different levels of well-being. And participating in our programs has had a positive impact on well-being, but the impacts have been far broader. We found that participants formed new friendships, ran into each other in the neighbourhood, and supported each other in times of personal difficulty. People who had previously led isolated lives found new confidence to socialise, and they found purpose and status, became more adaptable and resilient. And so far from being a refuge or simply a place of enjoyment, the museum became a springboard for participants in the community. We believe that a focus on societal well-being, on what truly makes communities thrive, both now and for the future, provides a challenge to our dominant societal paradigms around economic growth, individualism, and overconsumption. And in that frame, museums have a great deal to offer. This was evidenced in our report exploring the response of Welsh museums to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And in recent work, museums are building on our experiences of the pandemic, which have exposed the essentials of our well-being, such as human contact, support and care, and access to nature, rather than more material stuff. So in placing our focus on the well-being of people, place and planet, we have from the outset explored what we value in society, how we measure it, and the particular contribution of culture. In the UK, at least 10 years of austerity and an emphasis on greater commercialism has created a museum sector driven by the pressure of achieving commercial growth in order to survive. More recently, the pandemic has exposed the fault lines in the system, and dependence on visitor income has meant many museums find themselves emerging from lockdown an increasingly precarious position. So we offer a challenge to prevailing measures and open up a fuller consideration and a measurement of the contribution cultural institutions make within their wider localities. We recognised from the start that simply focusing on increasing visitor numbers tells us nothing of the quality and depth of their experience. So we measure our progress using the story of change, which challenges business as usual thinking by starting with why, the overall purpose, and working backwards. This methodology prioritises learning and engages with unexpected and unanticipated, the unsuccessful and the successful. And if you want to find guidance on our website, you can find the story of change guidance there. And we've also worked with our community of practice to explore metrics and a suite of evaluation tools and resources, which are also available on our website, along with case studies of many of the projects. At the outset of our project, we thought quite hierarchically. We thought we'd engage museum directors, they would take the ideas on board and they would cascade them through their museums. But we found very soon that the impacts were often individual, they were peer-led, and they were very personal. And so we shifted focus and built on this principle about being an active citizen. And where possible, we work with teams which we call diagonal slice teams, which cross over all the different parts of the museum and at different scales in the hierarchy, and also outside the museum with volunteers and the local community. So we break down traditional silos and ideas of expertise. And we also really emphasise a sense of personal agency, which is of course beneficial for well-being. So we see museums as places for encounter, where we can meet and connect beyond our immediate social bubble, where we can share and cultivate our universal values. And there's a particular bit of work that we've done here with our partner Common Cause. And our research from our partner shows most of us care deeply about one another and the world around us, valuing things like equality, community, and friendship. However, the research shows the large majority of us underestimate the extent to which our fellow citizens care about these things. And it seems that this misperception is holding us back, both individually and collectively. When we understand our common values, we're more likely to participate, to volunteer, and come together to make society stronger and more resilient. So we've worked with these ideas from Common Cause, and the pictured guide here shows learning from a year-long project at Manchester Museum, which developed approaches to modelling compassionate values and in interactions with visitors, volunteers and staff, and finding novel ways to support visitors to explore one another's values. Happy Museum focuses on sharing ownership and encourages museums to work from the basis of mutual benefit, give and gain with their volunteers, audiences, participants and staff. And through our principle, pursue mutual relationships, we explore how museums can work together with different expertise, but with equal status to achieve common outcomes, such as making a sustainable and flourishing locality in which to live and work. Our commissions have tested new ways of collaborative working. For example, at Derby Silk Mill, site of the world's first factory, where instead of hiring designers to lead a major refurbishment, they hired design facilitators who used a process called human-centered design to co-produce the museum with the local community. Thousands of local people were involved in the project, contributing 35,000 hours in shared endeavour. And the subsequent Museum of Making has just opened its doors earlier this year. The museum said that the work has had tangible impacts on participants as they've learnt new skills and built their sense of community. And the museum believes that habitualising participation has made their organisation more responsive to the community and more reflective in their attitudes and organisational culture. Other Happy Museum affiliates experimented with a range of ways of collaborative working, including therapeutic models at the Museum of Homelessness, the Art of Invitation, the Museum of Now, and Scratch, a theatre-based approach at Battersea Arts Centre. Museums are obviously places where we can learn together, and learning is core to museum practice, but the fact that you're learning in museums across age, class and culture, and that they're still largely trusted institutions at a time of fake news and offer shared public space when the openness and safety of the public realm faces challenges both in real and virtual terms. Cultural buildings often hold a unique combination of public safety and significant range of youth and family climate activism. And research shows us that communities who learn together become more resilient. A scenario planner, Barbara Heinsohn, identifies in How Societies Learn, exploring societal recovery after the Black Death. Resilience and adaptation come from learning gained in small, diverse groups, working project by project over time. And here's some examples of our projects. In Slough Museum, they held intergenerational community conversations where they used the collections as a catalyst and the museum's position as the facilitator. And they talked about food, health, celebration, focusing on the kind of future the community wanted for themselves. Alongside its sheep exhibition in 2019, Ceredigion Museum held a cross-disciplinary symposium exploring the contested future of the local rural landscape. Participants came together from farming communities, policymakers, scientists and artists, and they took a walk from the town into the uplands of Mid Wales and back. And they said that they wouldn't have had those conversations in any other way except in this way that the museum was able to facilitate them. So Happy Museums have connected their collections with discussions around city planning in Reading Museum, questioning whether a focus on driving local economic growth might conflict with the need to preserve the historic and natural environment. With air quality in Breathing Canterbury at the Beanie, and with issues of recycling and waste management at Manchester Museum, where they hosted a rubbish night at the museum to respond to local concerns. We explore the breadth of the museum responses to environmental crisis. Our environmental and ecological crises are complex problems, and they're intimately connected with other systemic challenges and require holistic and multi-solving approaches that engage the whole breadth of museum activity. At the simplest level, museums can be role models when it comes to environmental responsibility by engaging in good practice and making it very visible to visitors and communities. And of course, smart thinking about resources also makes museums more resilient, better equipped to address challenges and perhaps save money along the way. To be a sustainable organisation in the long term means using all sorts of resources better. The images here show museums' imaginative use of natural and recycled materials for craft projects, underused outdoor spaces for school activities, and even historic steam tractors, which are deployed to work on present-day potholes. But beyond simply reducing carbon and making that visible, there are many other ways that museums can respond. The lack of conversation around climate change has been identified as a major factor in the inadequacy of our response. The museums can open up conversations in a positive, collaborative and future-facing way. Manchester Museum staged an innovative programme, Climate Control, which rather than just retelling doom and gloom stories of melting ice caps, focused on the idea that we can change the past. We can't change the past, but we can change the future. And the emphasis was on encouraging critical thinking, creative solutions, and exploring the kind of future we want to live in. Meanwhile, Ceredigion Museum, who I've just mentioned, established the People's Practice, a monthly hub for local organisations, groups, and individuals committed to tackling the climate crisis and supporting them as a network. And in response to these climate strikes, we collaborated with Kids in Museums, Climate Museum UK, and Julie's Bicycle on a resource for museums working with the youth climate movement. In a range of projects, our museums have experimented with the wellbeing benefits and the impact on waste and our resources of activities like handling, making, fixing, and repairing in a museum context and alongside and with explicit connection to museum objects and collections. These projects connect us with the material world and challenge our wasteful relationship with its resources. So Ceredigion Museum, the bowls here with the spoons show a project partnering with a local wooden oven trust where they trained young people in craft and enterprise skills, creating a range of sustainable wooden objects for sale in the museum shop, inspired by and with deep connection to the objects in the museum collection. The Waste Not exhibition at the Lightbox celebrated the durability of everyday objects, from an old sewing machine to a toilet brush, challenging our attitudes to waste. And the immersive and social aspects of making have also had a demonstrable impact on well-being. In Derby, clinical tests carried out alongside making activities showed evidence of an immune boost detected in participants' cortisol levels, empirical evidence of direct relationship between making and well-being. Museums can also elicit feelings of awe and wonder, and feelings that the research shows can make you feel happier, healthier, and more connected to the people around you. In one study, participants spent time either near an awe-inspiring Tyrannosaurus Rex or just standing in a regular hallway. When asked to describe themselves, those viewing the dinosaur were more likely to use universal descriptors such as a person or an inhabitant of the earth, whereas those in the hallway used more specific descriptors such as tall, friendly, student, suggesting that awe increases our sense that we are part of a greater whole. And you might remember that right at the start of this presentation, I started with a picture of the Earth from space. So part of the framing of the presentation is about starting with a sense of awe and wonder, which reframes how we might be approaching our response to the world. And these pictures show exhibits at Manchester Museum, the famous T-Rex skeleton in the museum gallery, and a skeleton of Maharaja the elephant, which stopped commuters in their tracks when it was exhibited at the city's central station. Finally, museums can help us understand and explore humanity's adaptation, ability to adapt, and capacity for change. Their collections evidence the enormous societal shifts that we are capable of, shifts in energy, production, consumption, transport, and individual, as well as ethics and morals. So arguably, although museums can seem quite static in our heads, without change, museums would have no reason to exist. And we find ourselves in the midst of a period of seismic global change. We're experiencing shifts in individual and communal response to the pandemic, for example, and government intervention, cultural norms, which have previously been unimaginable. So we are simultaneously experiencing an explosion in online connection and communication, whilst also in some ways being very isolated in our own homes at times during the pandemic. And we cannot know what will emerge from this unprecedented combination of experience. And in this moment of crisis and rapid change, we're faced with immense challenges, but also unexpected opportunities. And we believe museums have a unique potential at this pivotal moment to offer context for and nurture the possibility of positive change. So to close, I'll close with this quote. This is the futurist John Shah, who said, "The future is not some place we're going to, but one we're creating." And he went on to say that the paths are not to be found, but made. And the activity of making them changes both the maker and the destination. So we believe at Happy Museum that our well-being is intimately connected to pressing global challenges, and that museums have innate qualities that could foster individual and communal well-being and contribute to a fairer and more sustainable society. And that museums have a real opportunity to help us imagine a positive future where we might consume less, where we might be more mindful of our relationship with the natural world, and create a more equal but no less interesting world to live in. So I'm going to leave that there, and I'm not sure how long I've talked, but very happy to take any questions. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Hilary, for your wonderful presentation. And I see there is a hand already, so maybe Kevin, you want to?
Yeah, thanks. Just to pick up on the last point, thank you. Really nice project, really nice presentation. Just wondering if you've run up against any conflicts. It's really nice to see a kind of systems approach applied to museums. It's something I found in my own work, that if people make meaning kind of between themselves and objects, or between objects and things like that. But I wonder if you've run up against any challenges because these days, with forces of decolonialization and of course climate change, you talked about a lot, that these kind of conflicts, that the well-being, for, let's say, the museum or for some people might not be for everyone. The conflicts with cultures, maybe where the objects have come from, and of course, material culture, as against a sort of natural environment and things like that. So have you been dealing with any issues like that?
I would say that we haven't come across we haven't come across conflict. So that's not to say that the conflicts are not there within, and the discussions and the tensions are not there within the museum sector. I think we're probably, what we've found more likely is that people haven't engaged with the depth of what we're trying to do, or it's less about conflict. It's been more about whether people step towards what it is that you're really wanting to kind of investigate. Certainly for the first few years of our work, we found most people really wanted to engage with well-being, but weren't really engaging with the broader framing that we were putting in the room around climate crisis. But the world has changed around us, so that is. So in a way, we've been able to respond to changes in the dialogue that's happening in museums, and I would say that is also true with the explicit connection to social and environmental justice. So we're, in a way, we haven't been at the cutting edge of the conflicted discussions, but we've been able to open up our framing as the framing in museums has opened up.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have a question as well. So you talked about how you use this basically story of change guidance as a way to evaluate your work, and you also mentioned like how you identify these like really subtle impacts. You talked about new friendships emerging, or about like people socializing more. So I was wondering if you can explain a little bit more about this story of change guidance framework that you are using, but also about the kind of very concrete methodologies that you identify, this kind of, very subtle and very difficult to map impacts from your projects.
Yeah, so we've worked with a number of different evaluators over the years for the overall project, and from the very start, we used the story or theory of change model, which I won't go into the detail, but you do start with the why of what you're doing, and you kind of work back from that. So what change that, what the why is, what you expect or hope will change, how you're going to use what resources you have in order to effect that change. And there's some great videos and models, if people don't know the story of change, on the website, which are free to use. In terms of the subtlety of the measurement, I wouldn't want to claim that we've been able to measure at that depth throughout our projects. That would be untrue. We've measured some areas of our work in great depth, and that particular piece of that particular thing that I was quoting at that point was work done at the Museum of East Anglian Life, where they use social return on investment modelling, which is it is in depth and time intensive, but they were able, and I haven't got the figures with me, but they were able to show and actually quantify the benefits of each pound of investment. I think each pound of investment came back with £3 of societal benefit. I haven't got the quotes, but it's somewhere on the website. But that was done at the Museum of East Anglian Life, which is where I had those photographs from, and that was right at the very start of Happy Museum work. So it was an in-depth piece of research at one particular institution, which then underpinned a great deal of what we did. So each of the projects we've done, some have evaluated themselves in more depth than others. But overall, we've worked within a nested story of change model. I can expand on that if there's other things you want to.
I mean, yeah, I would definitely like to hear a bit more about that if there are no other questions.
Yeah, just want to say that me too. I'm super interested in this method. So if you want to explain more about it or anything, that's great.
Yeah, I really would point you to, there's a video of Mandy Barnett, who's our evaluator, describing, and she there's a resource for doing it. And the thing I found most exciting about it was it's then also immediately transferable to evaluation. So the framework shows you what you need to measure, and you keep going back to it and saying, but that's what we said we were going to do. Are we actually measuring that? And we created a suite of evaluation tools that our evaluation was it's everything from observational evaluation to very simple tools such as something called the time capsule, which is when working with the same group of people over several months. At the start of working with them, they were working on their local area in Reading, and they were wanting to see whether perceptions of their area changed over time. So they gave them a selection of words that reflected their response to where they lived, and they put them in the time capsule. And then at the end of 3 months, they did the same exercise with the same words and put them in, and then they were able to see. So they're often simple. There's must be about 13 or 14 different evaluative tools on there, and they're all, some of them are quick 5-minute things you can do in a room with a group of people, and some of them are collecting data from spreadsheets, and they're just useful to pick and choose which are most relevant to what you've identified in your story of change as the things that the outputs you're hoping to see, and measuring how those work. But the social return on investment is intensive, and I don't think many people have actually used that because of that reason. But we kind of extrapolate out, if it worked in one project, it's probably having similar effects in others.
Thanks a lot. Alan, do you want to say something about your question? It's in the chat.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that.
Yeah, no problem. It's a very agendaed question. I'm part of the COVID Museums Response Project in Northern Ireland. So we have a strand which is about well-being and social wellness, and which is led by somebody else, and one which is about kind of digital intervention and storytelling, which I work on with a colleague. I'm a media studies lecturer, so I come at it from a very particular sort of angle, which is about the museum as a kind of engine for stories that we tell ourselves about culture and politics and history and all of those sorts of things. And I'm very interested in what sorts of new stories come out from what I see as potentially accelerating stories of kindness, of shared space, of well-being. The sorts of things that you've talked about today, and sorry about the mask and the thing. I've fallen out of my classroom. I haven't fallen out of my classroom. I'm sat in my classroom at the moment. All the students have left. We've just done a session on data storytelling, and it's probably partly because it's fresh in my head and partly because of the approach. But your framework really reminds me of like Diageo and Klein's work on data feminism and what they would call a feminist approach to data storytelling and data visualization, which embraces plurality, embraces complexity, challenges power in institution, that it respects the lived experience that produced the data, and really honors the kind of ability to create affect in people out of the data, and those sorts of, there's a whole framework there, but it seems to me that it's very close to the sorts of things that you're doing, but in a very different sort of space that they would term kind of data feminism. So I've been talking for 2 hours to students about what are the stories that come out of this sort of approach, and how do we think slightly differently about the work that we make as practitioners when we start to embrace, instead of trying to render out complexity, we try and embrace complexity and plurality and start to think about the mess of the world and how we navigate the kind of mess of the world, which I think chimes quite nicely with the sorts of things that you're doing. Sorry, it's Diageo and Klein. I'll put it in the chat after the question, but it's like, what new stories can we tell once we've been through these sorts of shared processes and challenged the kind of what I would see from an outside perspective, I'm not a museum studies person, as a kind of authorial voice and a kind of control over the narratives that we tell each other. And when we share that process, what new stories have you seen that start to emerge from that process?
Yeah, this is really a thread. It's made me thinking that I need another slide in my presentation about this. Thank you for putting. I don't know Diageo, but I'll follow it up. Yeah, the idea of, rather than being the storyteller, the museum as host as creating the space and the kind of framing and using the collection for people to tell their version of the story has been something that's emerged in a lot of Happy Museum work. So, for example, the Museum of the Home during lockdown called for stories of experience of home during the pandemic, and they said that common values just were threaded through that without having to. They didn't have to frame it. The framing came from what they were getting back. And I was just thinking back to Derby, when they, following on from their work on the Museum of Making, when they reframed their environment, their natural history gallery. No, their world collection, and they basically just asked people what three things in the world does everybody experience, and then they gathered all these ideas and they picked the themes from the most significant things. That's, I think one of them was love, war. They picked the themes that underpin the reframing of the gallery from what they heard. So I think there's some of that. There's a lot of that going on. A lot of that using the sort of seeking a narrative from people, whether it's individual narratives which then create a collective narrative, or starting with the idea of trying to create a collective narrative. But there's also, I think, in parallel to that, there's some really interesting thinking about what stories museum collections can tell. So I know, for example, Manchester Museum are going to be doing exhibitions on who owns land, looking at a key question for us at the moment is because the ownership of land is a huge influence on what happens on the planet. So that's an interesting question to ask. I can't remember what the other question they were going to ask us, but it was equally interesting and it's gone out of my head. And I think, the work at Ceredigion, really going out and saying what is the issue in the locality. It's contested use of the uplands. So let's take that and let's try and help people, provide a space for people to talk. And I don't know what narrative might come from that, but again, it's the museum using their space as a host. So I think the two things are going on in parallel, really, the creation of narrative. But it's really interesting to think of it in the way that you framed it. So thank you for that.
And maybe there's a follow-up question from Vitalia about how do we encourage participants to share their stories. Vitalia, do you want to say a bit more about your question, or shall I read it out from the chat?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Hilary, for such fantastic presentation. Yes, and Alan, based on your sharings as well, how do you have some ideas? How do we collect indeed these stories? Because I'm from Belgium. We experienced several waves. I think in UK you also had hard times. So it seems that people have big COVID fatigue and difficulties to balance energy and to engage. So what would be the more maybe joyful and playful way to collect those stories, that it would not feel again like something extra heavy to do, especially people, I think they have difficulties to write it, or even telling is not always so easy and obvious. Some people have talent for it. Some have very strong experiences, but maybe not written or oral ways of expressing. If you have some examples, more maybe other ways how we learn and make these stories visible?
My immediate thought would be an artistic response, so something that involved creativity, whether it was, I'm not an expert in playful work in museums, although I can direct you from the playful work we did in Manchester. There is now a network in the UK called the Playful Museum. Oh no, Playful Places they're called. It's called now because it's extended. And what I'll do, I won't search for it now, but I'll send the link to Playful Places, and it's a growing network of museum and other heritage practitioners exploring the use of play. And I'm sure they will have done work around this, because they've been doing work throughout the pandemic as a network and exploring ideas together, testing them in their museums or presumably digitally when they were closed, and then learning together. But my instinct is it's probably an artistic response is the most open to for all the reasons you said, that writing and so on is potentially problematic. Then inviting an artistic response is probably one of the key ways. But I'll direct you to Playful Places, because my guess is they'll have done some interesting things.
Thank you for your sharing.
As we are approaching the end of the seminar, I have maybe one last question. You also hinted at museums as being these like historical institutions, that they have this sort of like, you know, legitimacy, or let's say like institutional authority, so that they also have the, because of this kind of the ability to be in the forefront of using new methods and new approaches and kind of opening up these conversations. So how do you think that other cultural organizations that let's say don't enjoy the same kind of institutional legitimacy as museums, like what can they learn, and like what kind of steps should they take if they want to, you know, follow like have similar projects, or, you know, like use similar methods? Like what can they learn from this?
Oh, that's an interesting question, because I'm not sure that it is the legitimacy of museums that is the most exciting thing, that is the leader in the interesting work. For me, the interesting work in museums quite often happens in the ones that are less legitimate. You know, there's and also I think a lot of the learning has come from outside of museums into museums. So some of the most interesting museum work is happening in small volunteer-led local independent museums. I'm not saying that the big nationals are not doing, you know, the big trusted nationals are not doing good stuff, but there's a fleet of footness in some of the smaller museums, and a direct connection to their locality and community, which has meant that some of the most interesting things are happening there. So I'm not sure that Beyond the Sector has a lot to learn from the kind of legitimacy element. Certainly, I think there's a huge crossover in working between the work that's going on in, say, Happy Museum and the art. You know, we've had, as part of Happy Museum, we've had arts organisations, a theatre, as I said, a zoo, a cultural organisation. There's a lot of crossover once you're working in kind of, and the difference is huge. In other organisations, you have performance rather than collection. You know, you have another thing which hangs the work on, but. Yeah, no, I don't think the legitimacy is the thing that's leading the way.
Great, thanks a lot. So is there a very last question for our last minute?
It's not so much a question as just being really struck by the way that what you're describing in terms of practices really corresponds with some of what we've been researching over the last couple of years in the way of practices, but we've been hanging our thing, not so much even on performances, but on people who are getting out there and perhaps taking some of those elements more purely in terms of play, or in terms of getting people to respond to place, and just how much work you've already done in this space over the years that relates to what we're finding out now, and just how valuable it is to have heard you present it in this more formal way, so that we can absorb some of those crossovers and perhaps work a little bit more closely with what you've been finding out.
Great. Always happy to. There's something rather lovely about experimenting and learning and change happening all at the same time. You know, it's not a, you know, we do it, we learn, then we do it. You know, it's all interlinked. All the change is happening while you're experimenting. It's yeah.
Which may cause, you know, people who like to hold things steady and evaluate them, they tear their hair. But as you pointed out, we're operating in a pluralistic, complex environment where we can't actually hold everything steady while, you know, circumstances will change even if we hold something steady. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, we will. There is a recording of the sessions of Italia. We will upload that on the website so you can access it anytime from about a week.
I can also share the slides, which might help because they've got the notes underneath them, and they haven't got links in, but it would help you search for things if you've got the words written down.
Thank you.
Great. So thanks a lot, Hilary, for being here today. Thank you for sharing this your work, and also thanks to everyone for attending and asking questions and making this a very interesting seminar. So I hope to see you soon in more of these sessions. So thanks a lot. Have a nice day.
Thank you.